few weeks ago, I started a series on disturbing and controversial subreddits. The first episode was on jailbait, and thankfully this one doesn't involve the exploitation of minors, but it's still horrifying regardless. Let's investigate. If you enjoy internet mysteries and generally disturbing content, feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. I also have a Patreon and a PayPal, so if you're interested in supporting the channel, feel free to check those out, links will be in the description. I really cannot stress how disturbing this subreddit is. As always, I'll try not to be too descriptive, but there's no way I can make this topic lighthearted, so viewer discretion is advised. I'd highly recommend against looking at this subreddit yourself if you don't have a strong stomach. I really took one for the team with this one. You can head over to my Patreon for an uncut version of this video which spares no gory details. Please don't attempt to contact or harass anyone mentioned in this video. They could be suffering with a mental illness, or they're not, and this is some form of extreme body modification that most people don't like the idea of. Either way, it's not affecting you and there's no reason to be nasty to anyone. Penectomy is simply defined as surgical amputation of the penis, either part of it or the whole thing, and there are a few medical reasons that might require someone to undergo such surgery. These include cancer, botched circumcisions, and Fournier gangrene. Fortunately, it's very rarely necessary, though that means that there is a lack of support for those who have to go through it, and as I'm sure you can imagine, it would be difficult to adapt after such a huge change, not only physically but psychologically. The Penectomy subreddit is not a support group though, or a place for medical information. It's a community dedicated to penectomy fetishes. It has existed since August 2014 and has gained over 7,000 members during that time. If you were to ignore my earlier warning and visit it, you'll be met with many dick pics, often accompanied by captions that ask people to describe how they would remove it. Some of the images are penectomy-themed artwork or obvious photoshops that make it look like someone has had penectomy. There are also a few photos of what appears to be medical penectomies. They are of course sexualised. There are plenty of role-playing invitations too, like this post by a user who is looking for someone to play a female who castrates him. The female would ideally play an MCU or DC hero or villain, or a celebrity, bonus points for incest characters. He already thought out various plots which are different ways that he could be castrated. I'll spare the details, but feel free to pause the video and read the post. Most of these posts are made by people who just enjoy fantasising about it but would never actually get it done or do it to themselves. Every so often you come across posts from people who have taken it further than that though. There are men who have used rubber bands and devices to restrict blood flow which, if done for long enough, can actually cause the tissue to die and the penis to fall off. Thankfully, most of them don't take it that far and just do it sometimes for a short period of time as a form of bondage, but the same can't be said for everyone. Needless to say, tying a rubber band around your bits for any reason, for any length of time, is not recommended and can cause serious damage, potentially even death. There are also photos on the subreddit showing various types of self-injury and mutilation of that area. The most disturbing posts though, from people who weren't satisfied just fantasising about penectomy and decided to actually do it. There are many more people who claim to have performed penectomy on themselves than have actually posted proof, but seeing as one of the internet's mottos is pics or it didn't happen, some didn't want their efforts to be chalked up to trolling and so posted pics. I'm obviously not showing any of these, but let's take a look at 3 people's experiences. Around 3 months ago, a Reddit user posted a photo on the subreddit with the title, "This is my cockless crotch since I cut it off, November 28th, 2020. I love it so much. Most of all, it makes gooning and perving feel like eternal desire. Absolutely no regrets, bros." In the comments, he revealed that he had fantasised about penectomy for about 7 years, during which time he did various other mods and CBT. For a second, I thought he meant cognitive behavioural therapy, and I was thinking at least he tried therapy before taking such drastic measures, but on second thoughts, I realised he probably meant cock and ball torture. He performed the penectomy himself using various tools and numbed the area with 5% lidocaine antiseptic cream. He went to the hospital to have the wound sutured, hence it looked neat and symmetrical when it healed. He said it's not actually as painful as you might think because there are only pain receptors in the skin at the base. In fact, it hurt more when he hit his thumb with a hammer a few days prior. Overall, he seems satisfied with the experience, but warns that there are many risks and potential complications to any penectomy, and he doesn't recommend that anyone does what he did. There are actually many images of this man online. He seems very open about his experience and even stuck around to answer a few questions on the post. One of the most common questions asked on the subreddit is if and how someone pees after a penectomy, and OP said he is still able to, of course, but it's much easier for him to do so sitting down as he can't exactly aim anymore. OP claimed to have filmed himself performing the penectomy, and the footage can be found online. I draw the line at watching that though. The next individual we're going to take a look at is Trent Gates, whose photos ended up on the Penectomy subreddit, though I don't think he posted them himself. He does have a website which shows many photos from before and after, and also some showing the penectomy process which Trent performed on himself. In 2016, at the age of 20, he decided to remove his balls in a DIY procedure, using only ice water to numb the area, and nearly a year later decided to get rid of the rest, upgrading to painkillers and numbing cream. Like the last person we covered, he did the procedure himself, then went to the hospital after to get painkillers and the wound stitched up. When Trent was 15, he had become aware of gelding, a somewhat famous nullo. That is, someone who has had their genitals surgically removed, including the balls, which not everyone with a penectomy fetish also has a desire to do. Sounds like Gelding had his penectomy done by a surgeon, as he had to have several consultations with a doctor and a psychologist. He had considered it for a long time anyway because he was embarrassed by the size and didn't feel like it fit his personality. But the decision was ultimately sparked by a sports injury. Anyway, Trent was inspired by gelding. In fact, as soon as he saw photos, he knew that's what he wanted to do someday. And when he finally took the plunge, he felt happier and more free. Contrary to what you might assume, Trent had to meet with therapists and psychiatric staff, and apparently they determined he was not mentally ill. He hasn't had any regrets yet and believes he is now how he is meant to be and feels more like himself. One of the most well-known cases of DIY penectomy on Reddit in recent times is user Worthless319. He believed it was God's will that he harm himself, claimed that God had even asked him to do so, and after circumcising himself, then using a gun to remove his penis, then cooking and eating it, then removing his balls with a gun too, all on separate occasions, he posted on Reddit asking how to proceed when you only seem to fail. I am in the most intense part of the awakening process that is possible. All I have done is follow God's will to crucify myself, but I always seem to fail. I cannot, for the love of God, make it past the obstacles given to me. Now God has come to me through my intuition, calling me to sever more of my penis. When I look at what's left, it's about 1 centimetre worth of skin bulging out with an empty scrotum attached, and it's baffling that I am supposed to sever more of it. At this point, I'm basically carving a hole into my body. Please, I'm in the darkest times of my life, as earthly as the end times were, and I have no idea what to do or where to turn. I'm so afraid of the pain and blood of doing this all over again, thinking once would be enough. Worthless was clearly mentally ill and seemed to be fixated on the destruction of the world, believing that everyone would be wiped out by natural disasters and war, specifically nuclear war with North Korea, but him mutilating himself might stop that from happening. It went from him believing God wanted him to perform DIY penectomy on himself to him contemplating taking his own life for God. He didn't want to do any of this. He didn't like the pain and he worried how much pain he'd be in next time he had to do something to himself, but he genuinely believed that's what God wanted him to do. He didn't know why God would want that or why he was chosen specifically, but he was prepared to do what he had to keep everyone safe. He made various posts asking for advice on how to go about removing the rest of his penis and other general questions relating to death, like how to maintain tranquility through a painful death and whether people would choose to die for God. Users often tried to talk him out of going further than he already had, insisting that God would not want him to do that and urging him to see a therapist. And while he thanked people for worrying, it doesn't sound like their words made much difference. He claimed to have sought psychiatric help in the past, but it hadn't helped him and he was still convinced his delusions were real. He posted a couple of comments talking about how he'd travelled across the country to have a friend murder him and put him in his freezer, but God said he had to do it himself. In the comments on his final post, which was a photo of his dog in the sun, He announced his plans to take his own life on Saturday, and shortly after that day passed, he was never heard from again. Who knows if he stuck to his plan or if the whole thing was an elaborate hoax. He did post photos, but he could have found them somewhere online, or maybe the photos were of him, but he had to undergo penectomy for medical reasons and decided to create an internet mystery out of the situation. If his story is true, perhaps his lack of updates meant that he got help and managed to move on with his life, in which case I hope he and his dog are doing okay, but honestly it would be hard to come back from that level of psychosis. There is apparently a video of his self-surgery somewhere online, and he also said he planned to film his death and post it on Reddit, though I don't think he ended up doing so, or if he did, it was removed. So what on earth possesses people to fantasise about penectomy, let alone actually do it? Your first thought might be mental illness, which definitely seems to be the case for Worthless319. This user is different to the others discussed in this video though, because he didn't actually want to do it himself. He clearly experienced delusions that caused him to do it, as in he thought God was telling him to. Those delusions probably weren't helped by the drugs he took, some of which are increasingly being studied as potential treatments for various mental illnesses, but generally speaking, you're probably better off not taking them recreationally if you're already experiencing such severe psychosis. Worthless's story is tragic yet fascinating, but it doesn't represent most of the users on the Penectomy subreddit because he didn't have a fetish, it was just something that needed to be done in his mind. I should make it clear that the users in that community are not transgender, or at least being trans is not the same thing. I have seen posts from individuals who have that fetish and are also trans, but most trans women don't have that fetish, and many men with the fetish do not experience gender dysphoria or take any steps to actually transition. Trent, whose story we covered earlier, told Metro, "It really didn't feel like part of me. It's along the lines of being trans, but not quite. I have no desire to be a woman, it's kind of a middle ground in between the two, an androgynous in between." Trent is non-binary and uses he/him pronouns, however the first Reddit user we covered is cisgender. There isn't necessarily a correlation with gender identity. That user said this when asked why he did it. "Kink, my friend. Extreme, sexy, exciting, fun, crazy kink. It's also for me a way of transcending sex as it normally functions. I see my body in its present and future nullified form as almost a cyber or android-like form. It's a consensual sexual body modification, no longer reproductive in nature, still male but slightly androgynous." Penectomy fetishes are also different to body integrity identity disorder or BIID. As I understand it, it is possible that someone could experience both, or that a penectomy fetish could be a form of BIID, which can have a sexual aspect. However, most people with that condition tend to want limbs amputating, and not everyone who wants to undergo penectomy is necessarily suffering with BIID, as it seems that for people with that condition, there is an emphasis in their mind on being disabled, and that's not always a focus for nullos. Some definitely like the idea of being submissive and believe that penectomy would be the ultimate act of submission, or they're masochists who like the idea of the pain. Others just simply prefer the way it looks. It's not always sexual per se. Sometimes the reason can be anxiety related. For example, if people worry about size or performance, it might seem a drastic solution, but it certainly solves that problem. Nullos view penectomy as a form of extreme body modification, and they aren't all able to explain exactly why they want to do it, they just do. I guess it's no different to piercings in that sense. Obviously you can take them out if you change your mind, so the stakes aren't so high. But as someone with piercings, I can't really explain why I chose to get metal bars stuck through various areas of my body. I like how they look, but I can't really explain why, I just do. When it comes to tattoos, they often have meaning, or you just like the artwork, but piercings are just chunks of metal, there isn't any deeper reason. According to a study, voluntary genital ablations, contrasting the cutters and their clients, the clients being nullos and the cutters being unqualified people who perform or assist in the surgeries, risk factors for penectomy fetishes include a history of childhood abuse, being threatened with that kind of mutilation as a child, and being raised in a devoutly Christian home, among others. 45% of the cutters in the study reported that they were nullos themselves, but there were some differences between cutters and non-cutters, including that cutters tend to have a lower annual income but have a higher level of education, more are divorced or separated, they have a higher incidence of sexually inappropriate behaviour, and they were more than twice as likely to report having participated in animal castrations than non-cutters. The method of the study was a cross-sectional internet survey, which gained responses from users on a eunuch forum, so the sample might not necessarily be representative of the wider population. Nullos are relatively rare anyway, especially nullos who are willing to open up about their experiences, even if it is anonymously on the internet. By now, you probably see a clear difference in the reasons behind what Worthless did to himself and the other individuals mentioned in this video. But just because most of these people aren't hallucinating and thinking God is telling them to do it, does that mean that they're not mentally ill? Some would argue that the simple fact that they want to do that to themselves shows that they must be, and it's hard to argue against that. This is a relevant discussion point because it leads into the debate on whether or not people should be allowed to do this to themselves, or at least whether the procedure should be done by professionals instead, as you can't really stop anyone from performing it on themselves. Generally speaking, I personally don't care what someone wants to do to themselves, as long as they're fully informed of the consequences and they won't be harming anyone else in the process. This applies to any kind of body modification or unusual fetishes among consenting adults. Live and let live as far as I'm concerned. However, there is an argument to be made that one could never truly understand the consequences of such a huge life-changing decision until they've actually done it, at which point it's too late to change their mind. It's also worth keeping in mind that this is a one-time thing. If an individual's fetish relates to the operation itself, then once it's done, that's it forever. For many, it seems more about the after effects though, in which case that wouldn't apply. In addition, if someone is mentally ill, are they really in the best frame of mind to make such a decision? Similar arguments can be made in relation to cosmetic procedures too though, which are sometimes done as a result of body dysmorphia. Botox and fillers may be temporary, but the same can't be said for rhinoplasty or eyelid surgery. Granted, the removal of an organ is a lot more serious than the removal of some excess skin, but a big difference in how people see penectomy and the majority of other cosmetic surgeries seems to be that the latter are usually done to fit into society's beauty standards, whereas the former, when done for cosmetic reasons, is done to fit a less mainstream idea of beauty. If there was a way of determining that someone who wants to become a nullo is not mentally ill, and that they wouldn't regret the decision after it's done, I can't say I fully understand it, but I'm not about to stand in anyone's way. For many nullos, penectomy and castration turned out to be a good thing for them. Even if they were mentally ill, they seem to have found the cure. I don't doubt that there are individuals who have regretted it, or would if they actually decided to go through with it, and it's certainly not a decision that should be taken lightly or without professional help. Regardless, I think it's important that such paraphilias are discussed and researched, and that we don't just pretend that they don't exist. Whether or not you understand or agree with them, sweeping them under the carpet only results in situations where people are more likely to take risks and go to extreme lengths like performing self-surgery, which is much more dangerous than having penectomy performed by a trained surgeon. It's not like these people are choosing to have a penectomy fetish either. It's not something they can help, so to ridicule, vilify or outcast them is kinda just a shitty thing to do when their actions aren't harming anyone else. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments, plus any other disturbing or controversial subreddits you'd like me to cover. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Huge thank you to my patrons, whose names are on screen now. I really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday in a new video.